We're going to talk about New Deal measures that were taken by the Franklin Roosevelt administration to deal with the banking crisis. And it kind of is ironic because it goes back to Andrew Jackson, who wanted to close banks. Remember, because he didn't trust the Bank of the United States. So what did he do? He withdrew all the money out of the banks until they went bankrupt and went to pot. Well, Roosevelt doesn't do that, but he's got a similar philosophy. Because when he took office, the second biggest crisis he had other than unemployment was this banking crisis across the country. Now, I'm not making this up, and I kind of mentioned this, I think, a little bit yesterday. At this time in history, people were so afraid to put their money in banks. They hid them in mattresses, they hid them in floorboards, buried it in their yards. And I don't remember if I told this class or the other class, or maybe both yesterday, that my mother, I'm not making this up, she would have at least a couple $1,000s in cash wrapped up in aluminum foil in our freezer. Because she grew up during the Great Depression and she always wanted to have some money if the banks went to heck. You know what I mean? And she did that. I had a kid named Lance Million that was a very good student of mine many years ago. Very wonderful young man. And he had two rich uncles. I'm not making this story up. He had two rich uncles. And they lived in this area outside of Roberts, Montana. They had almost like a brand new house they built. But they were so conservative and grew up during this Great Depression, they couldn't even see themselves living in this nice house. So they basically lived in this shack that was on the original property forever and just used the house if somebody came to visit them. They were kind of bizarre characters, but they were very conservative and grew up in this depression. When those uncles died and they left him a ton of money because he was the only heir and they saved every penny, he made sure before he tore down that shack that he checked every cubby of that shack to make sure that those uncles didn't stash money in certain places. And when he did, he found a tremendous amount of money that his uncles had stashed in this cubby or that cubby in the rafters or whatever, because they grew up during that time. Absolutely not kidding. So my mom and dad, would have been in their 90s and a little older now, so a lot of those people aren't alive. But those people that are in their 90s now that lived during the Great Depression will do things like that. They'll save money and put it somewhere. You also hear stories of people that buy a home and they're doing some landscaping in their yard in an older home, and all of a sudden they'll come up on a can of money that people buried there and either died or forgot about. People actually did that because they did not trust the banks at the time. So when Roosevelt took office, what he did to solve this bank crisis is he declared a bank holiday, which is on your ID sheet, all across the country. A bank holiday. What happens when the bank we're going to have a holiday here, Memorial Day. What's Bighorn Federal going to do on Memorial Day? Be closed. So he declared a bank holiday, basically closing every bank across the United States. Now, Alexa, my dear, why would he do that? My God, that seems counterproductive, that if you want banks to run, you're going to close them all. Why would he do that? After kind of what we talked about here just a second ago. What was he afraid people were going to do? And that's why he closed the banks. If you were scared of banks, what would you do? Yeah, you would. You withdraw he's keeping people from taking their money out and burying it in their yards. Because if you take the money out of the banks, then you got nothing going for you, right? So he declares this bank holiday, and this action called for the closing of all banks across the country until he opened them. Now this action is going to prevent the American people from withdrawing their money until the president could work out a solution. Now that would probably irritate people, right? That you couldn't get your money out of the bank, but he had to do something to get this thing going. Well, the solution he comes up with is when he convinces Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. So he keeps these banks closed to make sure people do not withdraw their money out of them until he can get Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Now, that act basically stated that he would take off the bank holiday not on all banks, but he would suspend the bank holiday on banks that What? Why would he allow a bank to open again while he kept others closed? What was the bank going to have to prove to him before he would give it an opening? That they had enough money in the bank to cover their depositors' deposits, right? So if there was supposed to be 6.3 million in the bank because that's what people put in, if that bank could prove that they had 6.3 million in the bank, then he would allow that bank to reopen. But if the Bank of Victorin had deposits of 3.3 million and only had 1.5 in the bank, was he going to let that bank open up? No. So only banks that they could prove they had sufficient funds to cover their depositors would be allowed to reopen. Therefore, the shaky banks would stay what? Closed, and people then, once they figured out that your bank was shaky, then they would let the people take their money out so they could do what? Put it in the good banks. Yeah, do something? It's okay.
No.
Okay, so that was the idea behind it, and it worked quite well. Okay, got solid banks back on solid foundations, and took the banks that were shaky, closed them down, and people got their money then and would put them in banks that they felt confident in. Did some people probably still bury their money? Yeah, they probably did until they really felt good about the banks. But yeah, pretty amazing. Okay, that'll take us to our presidential election, the election of 1936. Now obviously you're going to know that the Democrats are going to re-nominate President Roosevelt for re-election. He has done very well. He's solved the unemployment crisis. He's made better relations with Negroes. He has helped farmers tremendously get their farms back. He's got the banking crisis lying down. Very, very popular. And he will be the Democratic nominee. You almost feel sorry for the Republican nominee in this particular election, who just happens to be Kansas Governor Alfred Landon. Kansas Governor Alfred Landon. So in this particular election, you're going to have President Roosevelt for the Democrats running for re-election, and the Republican candidate will be Kansas Governor Alfred Landon. Now, the only way the Democrats thought that they could win this election was probably spend more money campaigning. And they spent almost $9 million campaigning back in 1936. And the Democratic Party spent less than half of that campaign. So that was a big number in those days to spend $9 million campaigning. And the Democrats spent less than half. Well, they wasted their money, kiddos, because let me tell you the electoral vote on this. You know how many electoral votes Alfred Landon had, Charles? Take a guess, man. Well, you gotta have some. He had 8. 8. Roosevelt had 523. Now let me tell you a story about this. It was the worst presidential defeat. We'll see how smart you are. It was the worst presidential defeat since 1820. You remember the unusual circumstances around 1820 that would really make this sad, that you were the second worst to this election. I'll give you a hint. In this election, James Monroe ran for president. Who did he run against? Think about it. If you looked at your notes, you'd find out. Who did he run against in 1820? I'll give 5 points extra credit to the first person that tells me. No. 1820. First person that tells me who Monroe ran against, I'll give 5 points extra credit to. Who did he run against? First person. 1820. That's why you have a notebook. So when you get into college, you'll go, my God, I have all this information. Some of you aren't interested in 5 points, so Wilkie says I'm smart enough. Hell, I don't need 5. 5 points extra credit to tell me who Monroe ran against in 1820. I got time. Yes?
I just guess. Andrew Jackson?
Nope. 1820. 1820. So many notes. You only have half what you're going to have here.
I have 1816 and 1820.
Yeah,
Oh,
same.
read under James Monroe's profile if you can find it. That might help. On his profile, James Monroe. Profile. What? What'd you say? Who did Monroe run against in 1820? Nope. 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 Nope.
No one.
No one is right. He ran unopposed. How bad are you if you are the second worst defeat in history to a guy that never ran against anybody? That a boy, Andrew. 5 points for the answer. What a hand for Andrew today. Yeah, thank you. So think about that. This was the worst defeat in a presidential election since 1820 when James Monroe ran against nobody. That's a butt kicking, right?
What's the worst one? Was that 84?
This one was the worst one. I mean, well, obviously Monroe was because he never ran against anybody, but this was the worst one ever.
How many votes did FDR get again?
523 to 8. That is unbelievable. 523 to 8.
How much money did the...
He spent, now listen to this, he spent over $1 million per electoral vote. Think about that, am I right?
Yeah.
What'd you say?
I was just wondering how much money the Democrats spent.
About 4 million, less than half. But think about that. Alfred Landon spent more than $1 million for each electoral vote he got. 8.
Wait, you said Democrats only spent less than half?
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
so it was, oh. right.
Republicans spent $9 million and got 8 electoral votes. That's a waste of money, fellas, just so you know. All right, moving on. Now, things weren't all roses for Roosevelt after his second election because he started having some troubles with the Supreme Court. They started to rule that a lot of these laws that he passed to fix the Depression were unconstitutional. But he didn't care really because the crisis had been what? Solved. So he did run into trouble with the Supreme Court. They started to rule, matter of fact, they ruled that 7 of the laws that he passed during his first term were unconstitutional. Okay? So he had a little trouble with the Supreme Court. He also had trouble because labor unions were starting to form. You know what labor unions are? They can be really something else. Wyoming has a very weak teachers' labor union. Montana has a very strong one. This is a right-to-work state by law, so you can't go out on strike here, they just fire you. But in Montana, their union, for example, for teachers is strong. Labor unions can be good and they can be bad. I've seen labor unions where in schools, teachers get so nasty that they're not getting a raise that they say, we talked about this before, and they say, well, by God, I'm just going to show up at 10 minutes to 8 and I'm leaving at 3:30 and I'm not helping a kid ever, whatever, because they're mad because it's such a unionized thing. We talked about that a little bit tonight in the billing strike, and the kids end up losing out. So unions aren't always the great thing, and they're usually a problem for people in charge, like the school board. Not so much here, but the school board would not like to see a strong labor union because they become tough to negotiate with. You see what I mean? Or a man that owns a company doesn't like great, strong unions because it becomes hard in negotiation. And usually when they can't agree, when they have unions involved, then they take each other to arbitration, which we talked about. Okay, now, things went well. We're going to kind of get through this. Despite his struggles with the Supreme Court and labor unions, President Roosevelt decided he would run for a 3rd term. And that election is going to be when? 1940. What's going to happen prior to that election? Germany is going to invade Poland over in Europe, and a world war is going to start. So he's not only going to inherit the presidency if he runs for a 3rd term, he's going to be set up for a possible conflict with Germany, because Germany has invaded Poland, which we'll get into next year. This is going to start a series of problems that is going to lead to a world war, and it's going to be Roosevelt's job to decide whether the United States is going to get themselves involved in that. And we stay neutral. I'm getting ahead of the game here. We stay neutral until when? Pearl Harbor. We stay neutral from 1938 to December 7th of 1941. the events of Pearl Harbor will throw the United States into a world war. So Roosevelt knows if he runs for a third term that he's going to have to make some decisions concerning a possible war in Europe. Which will take us to our last subtopic of the year, the election of 1940. The election of 1940. Well, the Democratic Party is going to nominate Roosevelt for a third term, has no problem getting the nomination. Who's been Roosevelt's vice president the last 2 terms? John Nance Garner. Well, Roosevelt's going to switch, not because he maybe necessarily wants to, but John Nance Garner has had enough as vice president. I don't think he had a bad run, but he didn't want to do it again. So Roosevelt nominates his Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, to be his running mate in 1940. So Garner served 2 terms as vice president. He's decided he's had enough. And so Roosevelt's going to run for re-election, and he's going to nominate Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, as his running mate. Now, this is kind of interesting because campaign promises aren't always kept, are they?
No.
These were the campaign promises that Roosevelt and the Democratic Party made during this election. Number 1, they were going to keep the United States out of the war, if possible. Now that sets up the second campaign promise they made, is they would not send American armies abroad to fight unless what? Our nation was attacked. And that's what happened in Pearl Harbor. So he kept his campaign promise. He said, I'm going to do everything I can to keep the United States out of this conflict in Europe. But if our nation is attacked in any way, shape, or form, we will take action. So he was very upfront with the American people in his campaign. I'm going to try like crazy to keep us out of this conflict in Europe, but if our nation is attacked in any way, shape, or form, we will respond. The Republicans, on the other hand, chose a New York lawyer by the name of Wendell L. Willkie as their candidate. Wendell L. Willkie will take on the incumbent president, 2-termer. He was a New York lawyer. Now, he doesn't have a lot of political experience. He's just a very powerful Wall Street lawyer. Knows a lot about finance, has a little bit of money. Now, he's going to provide more competition than Roosevelt's faced in any of these other 2 elections. He's going to be the best competitor. Okay? So Willkie is a very powerful Wall Street lawyer. He's going to provide the most competition President Roosevelt's going to face in any election up to this point. Now, the Republican Party's got to have some promises, right? Well, their first promise is exactly the one that Roosevelt gives. We're going to keep the United States out of war unless we are attacked. So that was the same one. However, this is interesting. Guess what else they pushed for? A constitutional amendment to do what? Think now, come on, impress me here.
Draft.
No, think about what we've got going here. The monopoly we've got going here. Very good. Peyton, you're awesome. They're going to push for a constitutional amendment to limit a president's terms to 2. Because they're thinking Roosevelt has a monopoly. And they're going around the country saying, you know, this guy shouldn't be able to be president forever. I think we need to look at term limits for the president. So they campaigned on keeping people out of the war, the United States out of the war unless we were attacked. And by God, let's make some rules on term limits for this president. You shouldn't have one president monopolize the presidency. Now, up to this point, this will be the highest voter turnout in American history. More people came to vote in the election of 1940 than they ever had up to that point. Highest voter turnout in American history. So people are interested, are they not? Usually if they're not interested or they think somebody's going to win easily, they don't go to the polls. This was the highest voter turnout in American history to that point. Now, to tell you about how the competition was a little better from the election of 1936, in 1936, Roosevelt won 60% of the popular vote. This election he won 55%. So he actually went down 5% of the popular vote, which shows he was a little bit less popular than he was 4 years earlier. So his popular vote went down from 60% in 1936 to 55% in 1940. However, what counts? Electoral votes. Here's the electoral count. Wilkie, 82. Roosevelt, 449. That's kind of sad too when you say this guy gave Roosevelt his biggest or closest race and he still beat him 449 to 82. So with that, President Roosevelt is elected to a third term, and his goal and the challenge he will face right away is to keep the United States out of World War II. That all will end on December 7, 1941. And that's where we will start. And the final lecture of the 2017-18 school year is in the books.